Welcome back. You're watching CNN News 18 with me, Griha Atul. Shashi Tharoor, the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, spoke to CNN News 18's Zaka Jacob and shared his insights on the unfolding turmoil in Bangladesh, the role of the interim advisor of the country, Mohammad Yunus, and the so-called radical reset in Dhaka, and what steps India can take in response. Listen in to that important conversation.
I'm joined by a very special guest here on CNN News 18. He's the chairman of the Standing Committee on External Affairs, the Parliamentary Standing Committee, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us here on CNN News 18. You've seen the sort of violent scenes in Bangladesh over the last few days after the death of this Islamist student leader. They are blaming India for this. Your first thoughts on what is going on in Bangladesh, because there seems to be decidedly an anti-India sentiment and rhetoric on the streets of Bangladesh.
It's truly worrying because, what has happened is that a lot of lawless elements have come to the fore, and they have been essentially liberated by the lifting of the stabilizing influence of the Sheikh Hasina government. Now, I'm not saying Hasina was a model Democrat. She wasn't, and she could have done better, perhaps, to include various legitimate opposition elements to give everyone a say in what was going on in Bangladesh. But she did, nonetheless, achieve a tremendous degree of stability until it all went out of hand last year. Now, all those elements are out on the streets. There are the people who came to the fore during the student movement. There are people liberated by the student movement, including criminals who were in prison before this movement burst the prison gates open. You've had the previously banned Islamist elements, including the Jamaat-e-Islami and others who are out on the streets. And all of these people have created a kind of mob rule in recent days, which have turned actually quite worrying. It's striking that just a few days ago, before all this erupted, our Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs had written and released a report on Bangladesh. And we had actually commended the government for its role, its calming role on the relationship, and urged them to help support in every way the emergence of a stable and inclusive democracy. Now, what we are seeing is anything but stable and inclusive. And what we worry about now, I'll give you one small example. We were reaching a stage where we were actually coming up with methods of trying to increase and normalize our visa issuance, because a lot of Bangladeshis were complaining that they couldn't get visas to India for medical treatment, shopping, whatever else they wanted to come for. And we had dramatically slashed our visa issuing staff during the troubles of last year. And we were just bringing them up to normal. We hadn't fully got there yet. Now, suddenly, with all of this in the last couple of days, we've shut in Bangladesh. We've shut a couple of them, and visa issuance has stopped. And this is something which actually is hurting Bangladeshi people. So I think it's something we have to understand, that both countries gain from calm and stable events in both countries and from calm and stable relations. It's ridiculous that these lawless elements should attribute an incident that took place because of the lawlessness, where lots of characters are running loose, and some of them with weapons. And this poor student chap may have been a victim of God knows whom. But I mean, to turn that and turn around and blame it on India, India had no interest in destabilizing Bangladesh. A calm and stable Bangladesh is in our interest, and that's what we want to see.
There is a degree of concern here in India about, the interim administration under Professor Mohammad Yunus. He's said some pretty incendiary things about India, about, the Northeast being landlocked. Even in the aftermath of this recent killing of this student leader, he's not exactly, helped India's case, or he's not exactly tried to calm down tempers. If anything, he's actually actively flamed that. How does India deal with it?
Zaka, that's not fair. In fact, he's issued a statement, which is actually quite a good and constructive statement. The problem is, it's helpless wringing of his hands, almost like an observer, essentially regretting what happened, including the horrible mob lynching of an innocent Hindu on the basis of a false accusation of having defamed the Prophet. And he almost begs the lawless elements to stop, rather than threatening decisive action to curb them. See, the problem is these are not people who are going to be reading his statements or press releases. But if the police and the army are brought out in the streets and told, we want to restore calm in our country, we want to hold free and fair elections in less than 2 months' time, and this is not the way we're going to create conditions to do that, therefore the army or the police or both must do their job, then perhaps the mobs would listen. But right now, what we have instead is it's not fair to say incendiary statements. You've had conciliatory statements, but those statements may be read in India. Are they going to be read by the mobs? I doubt it very much.
What about the concern that maybe all of this is also being used to try and push back the elections, which are due for, I think, February next year?
So there is that theory going around that particularly the student leaders and their party and the Jamaat are not confident at the moment that they'll do that well, and that they really want to create conditions where the elections are postponed. We don't know if that's true. The government has announced a date, and the government claims to be committed to fulfilling that date. But for that, it may need to start doing things like imposing curfews, making sure that, the equivalent of what we in India used to call Section 144 is imposed on the streets so people don't run rampant and start, vandalizing and attacking innocent people and threatening our consulates and installations and generally creating an atmosphere of lawlessness and intimidation, which is what has been prevailing in the last couple of days. So if all of that can be brought to heel, then I think the Bangladeshis can move seriously towards an election. But I understand Yunus's hesitation because Hasina, you remember, was essentially trying to curb this kind of street disorder over what had seemed to be a relatively trivial issue. And it's because the enforcement went awry and some protesters were killed that ignited much worse protests that eventually toppled her government. So I suspect the interim government doesn't have too much of an appetite for enforcement measures. But you can't essentially bring about calm and stability without being a stern enforcer of law and order. That's the paradox of being a government that's come to power on the back of a student movement. The truth is, they will have to exercise the authority of a government if they want to restore calm to the streets. And I don't know if they're prepared to do that.
One final question on Bangladesh. For 15 years, Hasina was a friend of India in Bangladesh. Now, there is no political party in Bangladesh which is a friend of India, including, may I say, the interim administrator. So how does India deal with this situation? And also for the government of India, at some point, they need to take a call on how long do you house Hasina as a state guest, because she is a lightning rod for inflaming exactly those anti-India sentiments on the streets of Bangladesh.
Well, I mean, on that, I think the government has said that it's her call to take, so how long she wishes to stay here. As you know, the government of Bangladesh has sentenced her to death and then demanded her extradition to face that death sentence. And India has a treaty with Bangladesh, which it is honor bound to respect. At the same time, it has, shall we say, to study the legal implications very carefully. There are obligations, but there are also exceptions and so on, which will have to be studied and understood. And I do want to say very bluntly that there are broader considerations than the purely legal ones, including the question of how we treat somebody who has stood by us through thick and thin, as the cliche goes, and who is at the moment a guest in our country. So all of these things will have to be borne in mind. I would be reluctant to press someone like that to leave the country unless she deems that she would be safer somewhere else, and that somewhere else would be a place where this death sentence could not be executed or enforced through a treaty. So all of these issues are, as the American expression goes, above my pay grade. I can only point to the considerations. I don't know what the outcome will be.
But on the first question of, who is now a friend of India in terms of the political parties?
Well, I think India, don't underestimate India's ability to talk to various elements in the interim government, in civil society, in the media, and in the political process. I don't think that we need to assume that everyone around there is hostile to us. I think we can talk to the Bangladesh National Party. Don't forget that After all, when they were in power for 5 years, not that long ago, India managed to modus vivendi with them. It may not have been as warm and friendly as it was when the Awami League was in power, but it's not that we were in daggers drawn with Bangladesh when the BNP was in power. We can talk to them. And I would say to you that I would have some faith in Indian diplomacy to be able to deal with whoever comes to power at the end of a free and fair election. It may be a different story if the election doesn't take place and we have all sorts of this kind of lawlessness and Islamism running Bangladesh. That might be a slightly different story. But we're not there yet. And I think we should hope that calm can be restored and that free and fair elections can be held.
I do want to ask you a couple of questions on the Trump situation, the Trump trade deal. India still does not have a trade deal with the US. What do you make of this, delay and this stretch that it's taking for the deal to come through?
There are lots of informal stories going around Delhi that on at least 3, some say 5 occasions, the 2 trade delegations came to a mutually acceptable agreement and it was vetoed at the White House. So clearly, the White House wants some things that even their own negotiators did not feel necessary to insist upon at earlier stages. Now we seem to have reached pretty much the culmination of the process, whether we call it a dead end or not. The important thing is that the White House take a political call on how important it is for them to have such a deal and come to some sort of compromise so the 2 countries can move on. In the absence of a trade agreement, a lot of larger issues at stake are in jeopardy, including the broader strategic partnership, the cooperation in something like the Quad, whose summit, as you know, did not take place when it was scheduled under India's leadership this year and may still take place early next year if Mr. Trump wants, or maybe scrapped if Mr. Trump doesn't want it. So all that's very uncertain. There are, meanwhile, talks of cooperation on technology, talks of collaboration on defense, but I think the trade thing hangs like a very big shadow over all of this. And if I can say very bluntly on the trade front, we have to appreciate that India, too, has red lines. Mr. Trump may have his voting base to appeal to, but any Indian government in a democracy would have its own considerations. For example, swamping the Indian market with subsidized American wheat is a non-starter because you have an awful lot of Indian wheat farmers who would suddenly be thrown out of a livelihood, and we can't possibly do that to them. We are a country where 60 to 70% of the population, and therefore 60 to 70% of the electorate, lives off agriculture. And naturally, any Indian government would be extremely attentive to the needs of our farmers. So I would say that as far as the trade agreement is concerned, I'm sure that we will make compromises. We have made compromises, and we wouldn't have got this far. But there may be some compromises we are not prepared to make. Now, I don't know, and you don't know what the sticking points are right now. But I think it's fair to estimate that the ball is essentially in the court of the gentleman in the White House, and that if he were prepared to accept that some things he wants are not possible or not possible right now, but that a lot of other things would come through and a larger relationship is at stake, then we can do business. But remember, Zaka, there are 2 different elements here. There is the 25% that was imposed on us for buying Russian oil, and there was the original 25% tariffs, which themselves made a lot of Indian products unviable, because on those products, we are competing with countries like Thailand, like Bangladesh, like Vietnam, like Indonesia, and like Pakistan even, which are in the 15 to 19% bracket. So Indian exporters were already starting off with a 6% disadvantage in fairly low margin exports. So all I want to say is that what we want ideally at the end of this trade negotiation is to end up in a position where we are not unfavorably placed against our own competitors. If we are also somewhere between 15 and 19%, we can probably live with it and move on. But it's not enough just to reduce us from the 50, which is the worst figure in the world. It has to be something that is much better and that makes our exports viable. Currently, half our exports to America are essentially unviable. And though we are trying to diversify and do other things, the truth is this is hurting. There are people losing jobs in the gems and jewelry sector in Surat, in the textile sector in Tirupur, in the shrimp and marine fishing industries in Vishakhapatnam, in the leather industries in UP. These are people who are Indian voters who are losing their jobs. We have to absolutely protect their interests as well. And it's very, very vital that we get back on a normal keel with the American market as soon as possible.
Just one final word on this, going beyond just the trade aspect, even on the strategic side. You've seen the recent national security strategy paper that the Trump administration has put out. Do you feel there's a general downgrading of the India relationship, a downgrading of the importance to Indo-Pacific, managing the rise of China? The strategic logic underpinning India-US relations over the last 25 years was that India will sort of keep a check on the rising China that it is. But that seems to have been thrown out the window. Do you think Trump has downgraded the relationship with India?
It certainly seems that to a very great extent, he's downgraded foreign relations as a whole in favor of a, we care about ourselves kind of approach to the world. And whatever will make America great again is all that we worry about. There is also a more sophisticated analysis that says, is this the harbinger of what one might call a hemispheric policy, where America confines itself to its own backyard in the Western Hemisphere and doesn't give two hoots about the rest? Even if China were to dominate the East, it wouldn't matter to the Americans. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. That's one possible analysis. And they haven't explicitly said that yet, so don't get me wrong. But there's certainly a feeling that the national security strategy that was released recently is a much, much less encouraging or positive document than its forerunners and its predecessors, even during Trump 1.0. So we will have to watch and wait. But, given that India has always relied on its own strategic autonomy, and that India has had this determination to, as far as India is concerned, protect its sort of multi-aligned view of the world, where we are networked with various countries for various purposes, irrespective of our relationships on other networks. In those circumstances, we can probably adjust flexibly to whatever comes out of Washington, short of outright hostility. And the truth is that one good thing about our position is we do have multiple options. And I think India has kept all those options open. All channels of communication to every potential partner is still in place. And we can develop more or less one channel or another, depending on the realities of the time. That kind of flexibility is indispensable. And that's why I've been such an enthusiast for multi-alignment, a term I came up with 20 years ago when it sank without trace, but which I'm very glad to see resurrected and in vogue today.
All right, Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much.